Daniel 9:27 is one of the most critical verses in all of Bible prophecy. It's the verse that outlines the start, middle, and end of the 70th week of Daniel, what many call the Tribulation. But at the center of it is this mysterious figure, referred to simply as He, the one who sets the entire tribulation in motion. This is Bible teacher Nelson Walters. Knowing who the He is critically important. Get who the He is wrong, and you miss the start of a tribulation, and then the great tribulation will spring upon you without warning. You'll not have any time to prepare physically, emotionally, and most importantly, spiritually for what is going to be coming. As we explained in a recent previous video, God gave Noah a heads up, a 7-day caution that the flood was going to come so he could load up the ark with food and with animals. Imagine if Noah didn't have this heads up warning and didn't load the ark. He would have been in the same boat, pun intended, as everyone who was caught in the flood. And the same problem exists if you get who the He is wrong in Daniel 9:27. Now, I've produced a number of videos about the start of a tribulation, but a constant question I keep receiving is, what if the He in Daniel 9:27 is actually Jesus and not the antichrist as most believe? So today, we're providing all the evidence in one place. If you've ever had this thought, or if someone else has said this to you, this video, backed up by expert opinion, will hopefully put this question to rest. Now, there are about a dozen reasons, historical, textual, and just logical, that the He must be a ruler of some kind, most likely the Antichrist. Let's start with the historical reasons. The earliest church fathers taught that the He was the Antichrist, and that he would enforce a secular covenant for 7 years. Irenaeus, who met the Apostle John when John was very old, wrote about this in his book Against Heresies, Book 5, Chapter 25. Hippolytus, who wrote the Treatise on Christ and Antichrist, also viewed Daniel 9:27 as a prophecy of the Antichrist's actions during the end times. Both of these early church fathers emphasized that this final week was distinct from the first 69 weeks, separated by an indefinite gap, and would only be fulfilled in the eschatological future. This is almost assuredly the teaching passed down to them by the apostles. But over time, as Christianity became more institutionalized in the Roman Empire and by the Catholic Church, and apocalyptic expectations kind of waned. In other words, they stopped thinking about the return of Jesus. And by the time of Augustine, who the church calls Saint Augustine, although I think improperly, somewhere around the 4th, 5th century, a more allegorical and spiritualized type thinking to biblical prophecy gained traction. The early popes endorsed this kind of thinking, that Daniel 9:27 was fulfilled by Jesus. And the church distanced itself from its Jewish roots. So the idea that the He is Jesus is essentially a Catholic, or maybe you could even call it a Gnostic, reinterpretation of the original teaching of the early church that the He was the Antichrist. The popes also had the original Hebrew text, which Daniel was written in, translated into Latin by St. Jerome around 400 AD. This translation subtly changed the original Hebrew wording of Daniel 9:27 from the covenant being enforced for 7 years to the covenant being confirmed. And this allowed the Preterists in the church, those who believed that He was Jesus, to point to Romans 15:9, which Paul says that Jesus confirmed the promises made to the fathers and equated this with Daniel 9:27, when there really was zero connection. Can you see how convenient it was to use the word confirmed if it already existed in Romans 15:9 and just slip it in there into Daniel 9:27 when the Hebrew actually says nothing about being confirmed? The words that were changed to say confirm a covenant, well, it stuck. In the 611 King James translation, which was largely based on the Latin Vulgate of Jerome, they kept this word change. The King James also added some other extra words not found in the Greek also to Galatians 3:17. Look at the King James Version. It says, the covenant confirmed by God in Christ, whereas the actual Greek says no such thing. It should read, the covenant previously established by God. That's it. No confirmed, no in Christ. Christ was added by the Preterists to again link their ideas about the He being Jesus to something in the New Testament that they could hang their hats on. And unfortunately, most subsequent English translations even further tweaked this bad translation of Daniel 9:27 from the Vulgate by having the He make a covenant with the many. The vast majority of modern error about the covenant in Daniel 9:27 all stem from this original word change by Jerome. In this previous video, we had a dozen Old Testament and Hebrew scholars properly translate the phrase, and they determined that it should read, He shall cause to strengthen or enforce a covenant with the Gentiles and the Jews for 7 years. It should not say confirm. Now, we have a lot more evidence to go over today, but before we do that, I want to give you an opportunity to sign up for an amazing discussion about the red heifers, which are precursors to the coming of the Antichrist. And we're going to talk about their current status, when they might have that sacrifice, where it might take place. And that conversation will be with Eliyahu Berkowitz on Saturday, April 5th, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Now, Eliyahu is a senior writer for Israel 365 News, a friend of mine, and one of the world's top experts on red heifers. As you may know, the sacrifice of the red heifer is a crucial end-time sign before the temple can be built. So, if you want the true facts, not internet rumors, register and join us. As always, the webinar is free, but only available online, and you must register. A link to register is down in the description. Now, let's get back to the Antichrist and whether the He is the Antichrist or Jesus. While full preterism asserts that all of Daniel 9:27 was fulfilled in the first century, there's another theory, partial preterism, that emerged kind of as a compromise. This view gained prominence during the Protestant Reformation and beyond, as scholars like Hugo Grotius from the 16th century and other liberal theologians grappled with the problems of the Catholic position, which they knew was wrong. So partial preterists argue that only the first half of Daniel 9:27 was fulfilled in Jesus' ministry. According to this view, the He in the verse is still Jesus, who confirmed the new covenant they believed with many. Because they were relying on the King James Bible, they too were swayed by Jerome's word change. The second half of the prophecy, according to partial preterists, it does refer to future events, that final 3.5 years of the 70th week. So that was the history of this position. Probably stuff that you have never heard before. But of even greater importance is the textual evidence, what the verse really says. The He in this passage isn't directly identified. It's like me saying, he went to the store. And you'd ask me immediately, well, who went to the store? If I clarified it saying, Bobby broke the lamp, then he went to the store, you'd know exactly who it was. It was Bobby. In linguistics, this is called the antecedent, the name that comes directly before the pronoun, in this case he, and it tells us who he is. Daniel 9:27, the antecedent, is found in the previous verse of Daniel 9:26. The pronoun he grammatically refers back to someone who is called the prince who is to come, rather than the Messiah who is mentioned even earlier. That is not the antecedent. This prince is associated with the destruction of the city and sanctuary, which occurred in AD 70 by Roman forces, but mostly from Arab countries under General Titus. The Hebrew word used to describe the people who destroyed the temple is Am, a word that implies ethnicity. So the people of the prince are either ethnic Arabs or ethnic Romans, but not Jews like Jesus was. Old Testament scholar Leon Wood adds that the text points to an individual distinct from the Messiah, one whose actions are destructive and align with eschatological or future narratives. That's from his commentary on Daniel. In fact, the entire verse, Daniel 9:26, precludes the Messiah from being the he of Daniel 9:27, because Daniel 9:26 contains 4 historical events that all occur before Daniel 9:27 begins. Let's listen to that verse because it's very telling. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one or Messiah shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed, and he shall make a strong covenant with the many 1 week. So after the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and crucified. This was between 30 to 33 AD. Then the city and temple will be destroyed in 70 AD. This will take place during the Jewish-Roman War of 66 AD to 70 AD. And then the Jewish people will be exiled. Desolation that lasted all the way till 1948. Only sometime after that does the 70th week begin. This is why from the earliest church fathers, Christians were futurists, expecting a future 70th week. Some preterists have even tried to explain this by saying, hey, wait a minute, there's a Hebrew word for destroy used here, as in destroying the temple, but it also means to corrupt. So maybe this was only talking about corrupting the city and temple. We know that is not correct, because the city and temple were corrupt long before the 62nd week, which was about 28 AD. But disciples also knew it meant to destroy as well. When Jesus prophesied that the temple would be destroyed, not a single stone left on another, they immediately asked him for signs of the end times, because they knew the destruction of a temple was linked to the coming 70th week. But this suggested workaround in the word destroy is only one of 4 things that had to happen. Don't forget, there was also the crucifixion of the Messiah, the Roman-Jewish War, and the exile of the Jewish people. All those had to happen before the 70th week, not just the temple. The gap in the prophecy has to occur after the 69 weeks then, not in the middle of the 70th week. Now, most adherents of the partial preterist, the he is Jesus interpretation, claim that the covenant in Daniel 9:27 is the new covenant established by Jesus. However, as we just saw, Hebrew scholars like Emmanuel Tov, the world's greatest expert on ancient Hebrew, say that he causes a covenant to be strengthened. Well, if he's strengthening something, this requires the strengthening of a pre-existing covenant. Can't be the new covenant. That would be making a covenant. That's the old translation problem. So partial preterists are required to look for something other than the new covenant. Their only real choices are the Mosaic covenant, the one God made with Moses, or the Abrahamic covenant that God made with Abraham. It cannot be the Mosaic covenant, because in Hebrews 8:6-13 we read, the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is a mediator is superior to the old one. Notice that proves there are 2 covenants, not a strengthening of an old one. since the new covenant is established on better promises. For if there had been nothing wrong with the first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear. Now, the author of Hebrews explicitly stated that the Mosaic covenant was replaced by the new covenant, not strengthened, which Jesus established through his death and resurrection. It was not strengthened, it was replaced. And if the partial preterists say the Abrahamic covenant was strengthened by Jesus, this means it was inadequate to start with. You only strengthen something that's not good enough. Since the covenant was already grounded in God's unchanging promise and faithfulness, it did not require strengthening. Any additional act, including Jesus' death and resurrection, would not be necessary to reinforce what was already guaranteed by God's perfect nature. Additional factors excluding the Abrahamic covenant are the fact that a nuance of the Hebrew language tells us that the covenant in Daniel 9:27 is a secular covenant, not a holy covenant like the Abrahamic covenant. When a holy covenant is referred to, it's preceded by the definitive article, calling it the covenant. In Hebrew, this is habarit, where the article is ha. But when the article is missing, it's a secular covenant. It's just a barit. So in Daniel 9, the holy covenant is mentioned as habarit in Daniel 9:4, and the secular covenant is just barit in Daniel 9:27. Also notice the covenant is only strengthened or enforced for 7 years. The Abrahamic covenant is an eternal covenant, not one limited to like a single prophetic week. Plus, the main focus of the Abrahamic covenant is the inheritance of the land of Israel, something that didn't happen in the first century and frankly hasn't happened yet. It takes place from the Euphrates all the way to the Nile. Those boundaries that the Abrahamic covenant promises just haven't happened yet, and especially not in the first century. There's also a problem in the taking away of sacrifices. Partial preterists claim Jesus did this at his death and resurrection. They call it a theological abolition of sacrifices rather than a physical taking away of sacrifices. But in Matthew 24:15, Jesus tells us the abomination of desolation is described by the prophet Daniel. This description is found in 4 places, Daniel 8, 9, 11, and 12. And in 3 of these places, the sacrifices are physically taken away by the antichrist, not by Jesus. And this makes sense because Jesus didn't cause the sacrifices to cease. He only caused the requirement for sacrifices to end. The sacrifices themselves actually continued for another 40 years. Thomas Ice argues that Jesus' use of Daniel's prophecy in Matthew 24, as we just described, confirms its future fulfillment, as it directly ties to the Great Tribulation and other events that lead to Christ's return. And that's from his charting the end times. So in every case in the book of Daniel, the taking away of sacrifices are linked to this event, the abomination of desolation, and the activity of the man of sin, who is supported by Paul's description in 2 Thessalonians 2:4, the one who will take his seat in the temple and proclaim himself to be God. That obviously is not Jesus. But after all this, and you seeing that partial preterism is just simply mistaken, I bet you'd still like to see the evidence for the proper translation of Daniel 9:27, as opposed to the Vulgate and King James usage of confirm a covenant. If so, click right here to keep watching and you'll see what scholars have to say it should read, instead of what many of our Bibles currently say. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.